It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. I can see a few of your faces. I can see lots of names. I hope you're all doing well in these very strange times we find ourselves in. What I want to do today is I'm going to talk about ancient Rome, which is my speciality. And in particular, I work on buildings, state buildings in the city of ancient Rome. So bearing in mind there's a huge empire, I tend to focus on the capital of that empire. And I'm interested in issues of authority, state propaganda, how architecture works as a vehicle for communication for those who are in power. I've also done quite a lot of work on how people who are not in power then try and fight back through state architecture, but that's not something I want to talk about today. So without further ado, let me share my screen with you so that you can see some better images than just my face. There we go. Can everybody see that? Yes?
Yep, we can see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm talking today about the Romans. I presume that most of you will know who they are, but just on the off chance there's somebody who doesn't, I'm talking about the people who inhabited central Italy, a city in central Italy, shown here in the map of the Mediterranean. And they first started occupying this region, around the beginning of the first millennium BCE, and then gradually, starting in the middle of the first millennium BCE, started to move through central Italy to take control of more of central Italy, and then gradually took over the peninsula and then most of the Mediterranean basin. And you can see in this map an image of all of the area of the Mediterranean that was under control by the Romans in the time of Trajan, which is the time I'm going to be talking about. And that is the beginning of the 2nd century CE. This is the point at which the empire was at its very biggest. And you can see that North Africa is included. You can see that Spain, Portugal, all the way up. In fact, Britain should be in that darker orange color as well. And then going all the way east through Syria and so on and so forth. So this is what I want to think about. I want to think about Roman architecture and in particular, Trajan's column. When we think about Roman architecture, there is a very particular challenge that we face. And that is that Roman architecture, its basic forms are incredibly familiar to us. We have taken its basic forms, arches, columns. So here's Napoleon's Arc de Triomphe of the Carousel in Paris from 1809. Columns, Napoleon's column of the Great Army in Place Vendôme in Paris. We've taken these basic forms and we've reproduced them throughout time. And we see them all around us. So arches, columns are taken over, basic building types are taken over, so that the temple type is used for our civic buildings. You're looking at the Bank of England in London here. Courthouses too use the basic form that Romans had for temples. Basilicas are used for churches. Here we have Lund Cathedral in Sweden. And perhaps it's most complicated when we have very explicit quotations. And I'm showing you here a chunk of Mussolini's so-called square Colosseum in Eur in Rome. What was attractive about Roman architecture for people building after Roman times comes down to basically a simplicity of form, something like the arch that you're looking at here, and incredible solidity. Roman architecture stands for this really gutsy, solid, often very over-engineered building. And that makes these forms really good for signifying authority and taking the authority of the past and bringing it into the present. The problem we then have is we look at these forms that date all these centuries before us, and we think we understand them because they're just like our architecture. But as well as being built to last, Roman architecture served to broadcast messages that applied to a very specific set of circumstances. We can't access the meaning just by looking at formal similarity. We have to try to understand the culture and the politics of the time. And buildings, we have to recognize right from the start, were much more important to Romans in a sense than they are to us today. We tend to know often relatively little about the buildings around us unless we specialize in wanting to know about them. For Romans, long before they started writing histories, long before they started engaging in rhetoric, they were building structures, and those structures were what the political elite used to tell history. These monuments were memorials. The word monument actually comes from the word to memorialize. And so the stories of the city, the stories of its elite families were built into the city through Roman architecture. That's in the early days. Where I want to take you is to a later period, to the column of Trajan in 113 CE. Let's start with a couple of words about Trajan. Who is Trajan? He's the emperor who comes into power in 98 CE or AD 98, however you want to put it, and he rules until 117. He's known as a soldier emperor. He was somebody who spent a lot of time campaigning, and I don't mean political campaigning, I mean campaigning with the army. And it was, as I said earlier, under his rule that the empire grew to its largest ever extent. In 113, the Senate and the people of Rome decided to erect in his honor a column that was about 150 Roman feet high, built out of marble and set in a courtyard. You can see an approximation of what that would have looked like at the north end of a complex that we know as Trajan's Forum, and I've set that in the top there at the right. And you can see where this resides in the city of Rome. This just shows you a lot of the ruins of the city of Rome, but we're going to stay quite specifically in this space, in this monument, the Forum of Trajan, and then looking specifically at the column. This is what the base looked like and still looks like today. The base was covered with reliefs of military trophies. There was a door, and above the door was an inscription. The inscription I've transcribed for you here, and then I've translated it for you. It says, "The Senate and people of Rome, to the Emperor Caesar, son of deified Nerva," that was his predecessor, Nerva, and then now we get all of his titles: Nerva, Trajan, Augustus, Germanicus, Dacicus, Pontifex Maximus, with tribunician power for the 17th time, Imperator for the 6th time, Consul for the 6th time, father of his country, to declare, and you can see there's been some damage to the inscription here, to declare, and the Latin would have said something like, how high a hill and area was removed for such works. Now, I have to tell you that this inscription is very problematic, and people have wondered how on earth this column is supposed to show how high a hill and area was removed for such great works. And there have been all kinds of solutions to that I'm happy to talk about later, but I'll suggest one to you in the course of today's lecture. Then at the top, there was a semi-dome. You can see it on a coin here. And on top of that, there was a statue originally of Trajan, the emperor, and now replaced with a statue of St. Peter. There was also a platform, and you can see that there as well. The thing that has got scholars most excited, though, is the spiral frieze that decorates the column. It starts above the door, and it curves 32 times around the shaft before ending on the north side, and it describes two campaigns against the Dacians. The Dacians were a people occupying what is now modern Romania. Now, for historians, this is incredibly important. It's the only source, or one of the only sources that we have on these wars, these campaigns against the Dacians. And it's also one of the only sources that we have on ancient weaponry, ancient military tactics, massively important. For art historians, it's a stunning example of continuous illustrated narrative. And what I mean by that is a narrative where the action runs seamlessly from the start to the finish, with main figures like Trajan repeated, and scenes separated only by trees or by buildings or by the general direction of action, but no actual separations made in the frame. Most scholars accept that the narrative format was based on a continuous illustrated scroll, even though we have no examples of such things in the early times. I'm showing you a much later example of what something like this would have looked like, but as you can see, that's 10th century, not 2nd century. Most people also agree that it would have been based on Trajan's own writings. He wrote an account of the Dacian Wars, which he called a Dacica. And so that's possibly what this was based on. Now, there is no debating. The quality of this sculpture is spectacular. Yet, scholars still tend, at the end of the day, to judge that the column is a conceptual failure. And the reason for this is that the marriage of a freestanding column with a continuous narrative fails because in order to make sense of the narrative, a viewer has to walk round and round the column, head inclined upwards, uncomfortable, and sometimes possibly feeling a little bit nauseous. I want to give you one example. A scholar by the name of Richard Brilliant, shown here, wrote about this in his very important book, Visual Narratives, Storytelling in Etruscan and Roman Art. He also reproduces this cartoon, which I think is lovely, from Il Messaggero, one of the Italian newspapers, showing you the problem summed up. But this is what he writes. I'll quote a little bit of his text for you. He says, "The numerous small figures were progressively difficult to see, even if the low relief surface was once elaborately painted. Neither could they be easily comprehended from close by, because the proximity of the column to the libraries and to the Basilica Ulpia, those are the buildings around it, did not allow the viewer to step back sufficiently to gain a consistent, coherent perspective of the whole. Furthermore, the helical course of the relief band made it practically impossible to follow the path of the relief without losing one's place, especially as the figures became indistinct at the sides of the visual field. And it was, and still is, very difficult to understand the scenes in the higher elevations of the helix without undergoing the most taxing gyrations, complicated by lapses of memory which conceal the narrative trail." Wonderful piece of writing. I love some of the words he's using there, undergoing the most taxing gyrations. It's wonderful. But basically he's summing up the problem people find, which is, okay, fine, the sculpture is fantastic, but does it really work on a column? Because if we're going to follow this sculpture, we're going to have to go round and round the column. Now, this kind of judgment has led to a series of ways of thinking about how you should look at the column. Maybe there are other strategies that get round this problem. So one, for instance, is to recognize that in the spiral, there are scenes that are similar to each other, so that we have scenes, for instance, of Trajan addressing his troops, what's called an adlocutio. They're not identical, but they're similar enough that if you saw them at different stages of the column, you would be able to recognize them. Same is true of a sacrifice scene. Basic components are the same. There are also those who believe that the placement of figures is decided upon so that you can recognize figures more easily, and that you can make sense of the whole column while standing still, that you can stand, say, on the east, the north, the south, or the west, and given what is shown on the column, you'll get a full sense of the story. These things are no doubt true. And yet, ultimately, all of these solutions are answers to a perceived design problem. And I have a problem with that. I think if we're going to understand how the column communicates with us, what the column is trying to do, I think maybe it's better to ask ourselves a different question. When we find ourselves saying that an ancient artist or an ancient architect has made a mistake, shouldn't we maybe say the problem is our problem, that we just don't understand the monument properly? Now, I'm not suggesting a hard and fast rule. It is true that there can be mistakes in monuments. One of the most famous of all Roman architecture, the Pantheon, in its Trajanic or Hadrianic phase, stunning building, reproduced more than anything else in the architecture of the Western world, in fact had a problem in the design as far as we can tell. There seems to have been a change of plan halfway through, which led to these strange meetings of parts of the building so that things don't line up with each other. It's all very weird. So mistakes do happen. And I'm also not saying that ancient artists or artists in any time are all made equal. Let me show you some images from the Parthenon. These are metapies from the Parthenon, 447 to 432 BCE. And I think we could agree that the one at the top is a sort of fantastically choreographed image, whereas the two down below are a little bit more awkward. These on the same monument, presumably by different sculptors. So I'm not saying that ancient architecture of any kind and sculpture of any kind is always perfect. It's just that we should probably say that mistakes on the whole didn't happen, and especially didn't happen on high profile, expensive monuments put up by the most skilled workers of the day. The chances are that most of the time, monuments ended up pretty much the way they were intended to end up. The column may have been by Trajan's military architect, a tremendously accomplished man called Apollodorus. And in that case, the chances are pretty high that we're looking at what we're supposed to be looking at. I think it's also fair to say that the encircling motion that is required by this spiral frieze can't exactly have taken everybody by surprise. It's not as if you're sitting there designing this thing, getting everything sorted out, and then you build it and you go, oh my goodness, we weren't intending that. Look, we have to go around the column. I mean, that just sort of beggars belief to imagine that's what happened. Totally predictable. And if you don't like it, you can abandon it at the drawing board. Add to all of this, if it was a problem, why, in about 180, was it imitated in the column of Marcus Aurelius, which is so obvious an imitation that you just don't even have to explain that. So, a much better question, I think, than how can we make the column fulfill our expectations, is to ask, why did designers set out to achieve what they achieved? What and how were they trying to communicate? So that's my question. Now, I've said that nearly all existing scholarship focuses on the frieze. But assuming that the frieze, and then fitting it onto a freestanding column, were the main priorities of the designers, means that we may ignore other aspects of the design. We may ignore other ways of thinking about the column, and I want to go into some of those. I'm going to suggest, what if we went about this backwards? What if we assumed that what the designers did achieve, getting us to walk around the column, was actually what they wanted to achieve? They want viewers to walk around the column. If that's what they want, then the choice of a continuous spiraling narrative is a stroke of genius, because that forces us to follow the narrative and walk around the column. And then the decision to place the column in a fairly small courtyard forces a viewer to walk around the column in fairly close proximity. So, assuming that designers accomplished what they wanted to accomplish, our task is to work out why this was their goal in the first place. And here's where we have to ask, what was the function of the monument? Well, a 4th century writer, so a bit later, a 4th century writer by the name of Eutropius tells us that after Trajan's death in 117, his ashes were placed under the column. In 117, partly paralyzed by a stroke, plagued by dropsy, Trajan, who was campaigning, left his army in Syria and he sailed for Italy. He broke his journey in Cilicia, which is Turkey, and there he died, probably on August the 9th. His body was cremated and his ashes were conveyed to Rome by the returning army. Sealed in a golden urn, they were placed under the column until they were stolen in the Middle Ages. This is consistent with the interior of the column. You'll notice that if you go in through the doors, if you turn to your left, there's a little vestibule and then a small rectangular room. In the north wall of that room, there are traces of a marble bench or a high step, and this was probably Trajan's burial chamber. In other words, the column was Trajan's tomb. Now, there is a debate about whether it was planned as such, and I could go into that, but most people agree that was the intention right from the start. And this function is significant because literary sources tell us, that is, ancient authors tell us, that the act of encirclement, or what we call circumambulation, walking around, was a central component of Roman funerary ritual. Now, let's think about this not just in Roman terms, but in terms of societies throughout the world. Romans are like many people in that they ascribed magical properties to circles and to the act of encircling an object or a person. And they used the magical properties of the circle and the act of encircling for a whole variety of purposes. A circle could concentrate attention and power on its center. And here I would point to something like the Kaaba in Mecca, where people circumambulate the shrine at the center as a way of recognizing it as a holy shrine. Or we could look at, for instance, the ring shout, an ecstatic, transcendent religious ritual that was first practiced by African slaves in the West Indies and the US, where worshippers move in a circle while shuffling and stomping their feet and clapping their hands. And you can see an enactment of that here. In fact, in most contemporary witchcraft, that is witchcraft today, almost every ritual begins with the formation of a circle and then circular movement. Now, the Romans in particular tell us, Pliny, the writer of the 1st century, he tells us that, and I think this is kind of interesting in an age of Botox and liposuction, that Phrygians and Lycaonians, these are people who live in what is now Turkey, believed that the egg of a partridge or another bird passed around a woman's breasts 3 times would prevent them from sagging. So it's the circling motion. We have Artemidorus, the 2nd century, who works on analyzing dreams. And he tells us that a dream can be a restrictive boundary. We have an ancient novel, the novel Satyricon of the 1st century, where a character says to a young boy that if he urinated in a circle around him, he could stop the boy from escaping. So the circle, according to the dream interpreter Artemidorus, can be a defensive device. It protects the area it encloses. And we're told of circular movement around a city, making a boundary when it is founded and also thereafter. And we also know that that boundary was sacred. Now, if we go to funerary rituals in particular, we know that participants would circumambulate the funerary pyre to the left. And we know that with funerals for emperors, there was very extravagant display of this kind. We're told that a ritual for the late 2nd century emperor by the name of Pertinax, that, quote, when an enormous pile of these aromatic spices had been accumulated and the entire place had been filled, there is a cavalry procession around the pyre in which the whole equestrian order rides in a circle round and round in a fixed formation, following the movement and the rhythm of the Pyrrhic dance. Chariots too circle round in the same formation, with their drivers dressed in purple bordered togas. We're also told that when the living visited the ancestral tombs of the dead, that is, after the burial, they would turn around the graves. So in other words, what we're hearing is this happens not just at the moment of burial, but also in subsequent years as a funerary ritual. Rituals of this kind then explain why in the tombs of Roman emperors, we will get these circular corridors, the mausoleum of Augustus, the mausoleum of Hadrian, and these corridors allow circumambulation of the burial tomb. The mausoleum of Hadrian, where that column seems to, the corridor seems to vanish, is in fact going up to a next level. And here you're forced, if you visit, to go round the burial chamber before you go inside it. What we're getting then is probably a desire to protect or confine the dead inside the tomb, to purify the deceased, because the visitor, when moving through the tomb, is in a very strange place between living and dead, and maybe to purify, to protect the visitor and to mirror the soul of the dead moving from life to death. Now, it may be that the reason this was set up in the first place as a ritual is long lost. And in fact, maybe it was just a matter of an honorific process that focused attention on the middle of it. In any case, if we go to Trajan's column, we could say that the designer may have had a specific interest in getting visitors to circumambulate the column. And probably he, used a continuous narrative to encourage movement in a prescribed direction. That is, by enticing the viewer to follow the trail of the narrative, he could force them to walk around the column. What that meant was that visitors were encouraged to circumambulate the burial spot of the emperor, committing him to his resting place and reenacting and perpetuating rituals performed at his burial. This takes place in front of a temple of divine Trajan, and given how many people were in the forum at any given moment, it was a perpetual form of honoring. So I love this image. This is actually nothing to do with Trajan, but it sort of looks like the kind of thing I'm trying to evoke. His motion, the motion that we make even today, going round the column, honors and protects the ruler's mortal remains. So that's one thing I would say that is very specific to Roman culture, that we have to understand these burial rituals to understand what the column is actually about. We could then say that once we're allowed to let go of the spiral frieze as something that we have to obsess about, if we recognize that it's just a sort of means to an end, we can also think about other aspects of the design of the column. And I have to say that if I were a betting person and I thought I could go back to the 2nd century CE and ask a Roman, any ordinary Roman, what they thought about the column of Trajan, I'm going to bet you that their answer would actually have relatively little to do with the spiral frieze. And it would, in fact, have much more to do with the architectural wow factor. Romans loved the wow factor, and I can talk much more about that, probably more than you want to hear. Anyway, the column, which I show you here in a reconstruction done by a British scholar, Amanda Claridge, shown without the frieze. She was trying to make a different point, but I like this image because it shows you without the frieze. The column was nothing less than a world wonder. It was the first freestanding column on anything like this scale, which made it, frankly, an engineering marvel. And if that wasn't enough, running through the very center of it was a spiral staircase, the first of its kind, carved out of the very marble that held it up. It wasn't just a feat of architectural bravado. It wasn't just a fantastic engineering feat, but it also had a function. It was Rome's first belvedere, its public viewing station. Now, it's fair to say by the time of Trajan, Rome had its share of tall buildings, and if you could get access to their roof, not easy, but if you could, you might be able to look out over the growing city. This is from a rooftop today in Rome. But the column was, I think, the first public belvedere designed precisely as a viewing station. And what I want you to do is to imagine yourself back to a different age where there were no skyscrapers, where there was no aerial photography. These things make us very blasé about seeing things from above. If you don't have those things and you look down, even on a city that you think you know, it is the most fantastic thing. It's a kind of godlike experience. And what I want you to do is to think a little bit about what the impact of this would be. Again, here we have a bit of a problem in trying to understand the impact, because we have a tendency today, and I think this is especially true in the US, less so in Europe, but still, we have a tendency to show a tremendous respect for works of antiquity. And I'm using this image slightly cheekily, because this is actually, these are workers' barriers, but what we tend to do is to put antiquities behind barriers. We make it so that these white, pristine, pure monuments can be looked at, they can be admired, but they can't be touched and they can't be experienced. And this is a bit of a problem. It is changing. It's changing in the last decades of scholarship. And I show you these books just to encourage you to go out and find them. A wonderful, wonderful writer by the name of William MacDonald, who wrote about experiencing Roman architecture. Fantastic books. And then a book by Diane Favreau, retired now from UCLA, about the urban image of Augustan Rome, which starts with a narrative, a fictional narrative of two people walking around the city in the Caesarean period, and then later, at the end of it, is another narrative. Really nice book. So these things, along with computer reconstructions, are helping people to feel Roman architecture a little bit more, not to keep it so sort of cerebral and untouchable. And so what I want to do today is to take you, if at all possible, on a little walk through Trajan's Forum and then up Trajan's Column. And I'm going to be relying on some other books, lovely books. Rudolf Arnheim, The Dynamics of Architectural Form, short little book. You can probably buy it for $3 on Amazon. Lovely. It just talks about how you feel in different types of architecture. Really great book. And then another, The Image of the City by Kevin Lynch, where he's really talking about how cities are experienced. And then this book, The Forum of Trajan in Rome, which is specifically about the monument that we're looking at, the grander monument, and then includes something about the column as well. So I'm going to be using these works to take you through the forum a little bit and then to the column. So let's get involved. From the minute that you step into Trajan's Forum, you being a 2nd century Roman at this point, you step in on the south side, and from the minute that you do so, you can see the column rising up behind the building in front of you, holding up Trajan's gilded statue high into the sky. As you walk, you're also guided to look there, because there are rows of trees that direct your attention there. There's an equestrian statue in the middle of the forum, and it creates an axis that encourages your eye to move in that direction. And then there are porticos on the sides that you can see that also lead you towards the end of this piazza. To get to the column, you have to pass through this building at the end, which is a basilica. This is a kind of building for justice and various other kinds of things. It's not a Christian building. This is a pagan building. And when you get to this enormous building, 600 Roman feet long, you walk inside, and in there you see these vast spaces, rows of columns that give you intricate vistas, places of dark and light, daylight coming in from these open areas at the top, these kind of skylights almost. You then walk out of one of two small doors in the north side, roughly the north side, and then you come to this courtyard. Now the courtyard, here the scale shifts. You're surrounded by buildings on all sides. You can see to one side, you can see one of the libraries. There would be another library standing behind us, the way that this has been created. And then there'd be a temple to the sort of north of us, and then the basilica behind us. Now, you've come into this courtyard, and even though you know the column is there because you've seen it from a distance, it must have leapt up in front of you, changing your sense of scale with this incredible verticality that was really emphasized by how restricted the courtyard was. You then enter through the little door on the side of the column. And to the left is a burial chamber, as we've seen, sealed after 117. And to the right rose the spiral staircase. And I'm showing you here the spiral staircase inside that later column that I showed you, the column of Marcus Aurelius, but it looks very much the same as this. As you labor up inside the shaft, going up this steep, steep staircase, you're climbing in darkness, alleviated only here and there by small slit windows in the thick encircling walls. Through the windows, you can see little snatches of sky and cityscape, enticing to your eye, but they don't really help you orient yourself. They're actually just sort of disorienting, in fact, in your turning ascent up the column. Now, the spiral staircase acts in a way as a long upward corridor leading to the platform at the top. And I want to invoke Rudolf Arnheim here, because I think he writes really interestingly about corridors like this. He talks about how corridors create a stalling effect in front of an ultimate goal. And he calls this temporary retardation. And this is what he has to say about it. He says, known in the arts as a strong incentive toward onward movement, it's also a standard device of traditional drama. It's constantly used in music to dam the melodic flow before a new surge of power. Suspense derives from the temporary suspension of action. And I think you all know in music how sometimes the music will go really slow before the grand denouement. And this is what he's describing in all kinds of different arts. And he says that a corridor does the same thing. It slows you down before something really momentous. So that's the way that this corridor, I think, is working. And then you have to add to that the general effect, the disorientation that's caused by circling, and in particular, the effect of a spiral staircase. Now, this is a spiral staircase in a medieval castle in the town of Orford in Britain, which is close to where my family lives. A spiral staircase has this strange quality, and I can't see any of your faces right now, but I know that I'm afraid of heights, and I find spiral staircases incredibly unnerving to climb, which is one of the reasons I think that I find a slightly bizarre fascination with them. And I think what's really difficult about them is that by the time you've gone really just 3/4 of a turn, you have no idea how far you've gone or how much further you have to go. So you are literally suspended in space. So think about this, think about the disorientation that you feel. And along with that disorientation, because you don't know where the end is, you're constantly anticipating it. You want to get to that ending. You're waiting, waiting, waiting. Now, an especially restrictive corridor, like the staircase inside the column, contributes to your anticipation because it's getting tighter and tighter and tighter. But then you get this incredible moment where it's resolved into a new expansion, where suddenly the restriction is gone. You get this amazing effect, this stimulating effect of a sudden surprise, the grand moment in music, the opening up of something unforeseen. And in Trajan's column, this amazing moment is an abrupt emergence from the narrow, dark staircase into dazzling sunlight, where you stand blinded for a moment, surrounded on all sides by open air, released from total restriction into utter freedom. So this is the moment of revelation, planned as an incredible culmination of the viewer's experience. And there's an obvious question which comes next. And that question is, where do you come out? So, harnessing all the force of this big moment, the designers, I think, chose a very specific vista for when you came out of the top of the column. You might expect, I suppose, that they would place the door at the top above the lower entrance to make a kind of symmetry of a sort, overlooking the basilica and then the forum. And I'm showing you what I think is roughly 110 degrees here, which is what you see in a human eye span. But they didn't do that. Maybe they could have come out north, looking at the temple, but they didn't do that. The west, looking towards the capital. They didn't do that either. Instead, where it came out was on the west. So that as you walked out of this door and you would take a step slightly to your right, given the nature of how the staircase worked, the first sight on emerging into light was an extraordinary and very expensive market complex, where once there had been hillside. The hillside had been cut away to make this possible. And then, as you moved around, you would then see the entirety of this forum. I think this is how we're supposed to understand that bizarre inscription, in order to show how great a work had been removed for this work, how great a, whatever it was, mountain had been removed for this great work. Literally, the hillside had been removed for this. And you see it literally from this point. So what's the message apart from that? I think we can say that through this magnificent forum market complex, the idea was that Trajan should be remembered as one of Rome's great benefactors. The column would provide a place for a viewer like us to survey everything that he had built. But it was also something more, because the design of the forum is rather unlike previous forum designs. And in fact, it rather resembles the design of a Roman military camp. And in fact, this image of a military camp should be flipped, and then you can see that number 1 is where the column is. And what a viewer might have been intended to recognize was, as well as Trajan as a great benefactor, was his role as an accomplished general, the role upon which his authority and eventually his deification were based. And throughout the forum, we see references to triumph through architecture and sculpture. But there was also, I think, a policy issue at stake, because Trajan had inherited an empire from his predecessor in tremendous economic difficulty. And like others before him, he turned to war to remedy it. Now, not everybody is in favor of war. Many Romans saw war not as a source of wealth, but as a very costly undertaking in terms of manpower and in terms of money. And Trajan may have known that he would have potential critics, and particularly some in the Senate, and that he needed to justify wars that he had already waged and any others that he planned. He needed to demonstrate the competence of the men who worked for him, to show Rome's superiority in the world, and to fend off accusations of a needless waste, an irresponsible waste of resources. So what better way than to employ his military engineer, Apollodorus, to undertake an apparently impossible task in the heart of Rome, to cut away the very ground upon which city dwellers trod and erect in its place a new urban center. And near the end of the forum, to have him or maybe another designer, but probably Apollodorus, create a powerful image of dominance, an enormous column with a spiral staircase carved out of the very marble that held it up, from which the viewer could survey the forum designed as a symbol of army organization. He also needed to display as aggressively as possible the enormous quantities of plunder that he had won through war, sufficient to build the whole of the forum out of plunder. The column towered above the forum, a vantage point from which to experience the whole magnificent effect. We can't really overestimate the importance of this message, because in 113, soon after dedicating the column, he would set out on another campaign, this time against the Parthians, and that's in what is now modern Iran. Historians later, that is ancient historians, would suggest that the Parthian wars were fought for glory, not for necessity. They actually meant terrible toils, terrible dangers, massacre of countless garrisons, and the loss of recent acquisitions in the east, and very little was gained. In all likelihood, what Trajan was thinking while he was planning and embellishing his forum was that he needed to go, that he was going to go on this new campaign to get further military renown. And the criticisms that he later got from ancient historians were precisely those he might have anticipated and tried to preempt in the messages of his monuments. So what I'm suggesting, to wrap up, is that we should think of a different set of strategies for reading the column of Trajan, and that these different strategies give us a different picture of the design process and of how the column communicated. I think it's very unlikely that in antiquity it was conceived as just a silent scaffold for a history in pictures. And I think that it was a dynamic, powerful tool of propaganda. Its design made visitors complicit in its message, whether they were conscious of it or whether they weren't. And I think it's only by putting it in its ancient context that we can begin to understand what it actually was doing. And that's the end of my presentation.